The last dawn of a 1,000-year empire on May 29, 1453, shortly before sunrise, behind walls that had stood for more than 1,000 years. The final battle in the history of the Roman Empire began. Yes, the Roman Empire, because the residents of the besieged city didn't call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans, direct heirs of the state founded by Augustus almost 1,500 years earlier. By that May night, of the empire that had once stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf, essentially only one city remained, Constantinople itself, surrounded on every side by the territory of the young, rapidly rising Ottoman Empire. By dawn, it was over, and the fall of this single city became one of those rare moments in history after which the world was quite literally divided into before and after. The city no one could take by storm. To understand how shocking the fall of Constantinople was to contemporaries, you have to understand what this city had been for the previous 1,000 years. Its famous Theodosian walls, a triple ring of fortifications built back in the 5th century CE, were considered practically impregnable. Over more than 1,000 years, these walls withstood dozens of serious sieges. The Avars, the Persians, the Arabs twice tried to starve or storm the city into submission. The Bulgarians, the Crusaders, almost all of them walked away with nothing, with one tragically notable exception in 1204, when the city fell not to an external enemy, but to the hands of its fellow Christians, participants of the Fourth Crusade, who sacked Constantinople to the ground. By the 15th century, the city still hadn't fully recovered from the catastrophe 2.5 centuries earlier. A population that had once reached 500,000 people at its peak had shrunk, by various estimates, to somewhere between 40 and 50,000 by 1453. The city had quite literally emptied out, with vast stretches within its once crowded walls turned into abandoned lots, fields, and gardens. The empire nominally ruled from Constantinople by this point controlled little more than a sliver of territory around the capital itself, plus a couple of isolated enclaves in southern Greece. All that remained to the last Roman emperor, Constantine, was the city itself and its ancient, legendary walls. A cannon cast over the course of months, the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, who took the throne at the age of 21, had reportedly been obsessed with capturing Constantinople since his youth. Legend has it that as a teenager, he sketched plans for storming the city in the margins of his schoolwork. The problem was that classical siege tactics against the Theodosian walls would fail just as they had failed for centuries before. Something fundamentally new was needed. That something new turned out to be artillery on a scale never before seen. Mehmed hired a Hungarian founder-engineer named Urban, who had previously offered his services to the Byzantines themselves, but the besieged, impoverished empire simply couldn't afford to hire him. Urban turned to the Ottomans instead, and there he found a far warmer welcome and a far larger budget. The result was a gigantic bombard, later nicknamed the Basilica cannon, more than 8 meters long, capable of hurling stone cannonballs weighing over 500 kilograms, a distance of 1.5 miles. Casting this monster took 3 months, and transporting it to the walls of Constantinople required 60 oxen and several hundred men hauling the carriage along a specially leveled road over the course of several weeks. The gun was so enormous that it reloaded agonizingly slowly, only a few shots a day, and its barrel had to be cooled with oil after each firing to keep the metal from cracking under the temperature swing. Even so, the effect was devastating. Walls that had withstood 1,000 years of swords, arrows, and battering rams began to crumble methodically under the impact of stone balls the size of a small car. This was one of the first moments in military history when it became absolutely clear the age of impregnable medieval fortresses was coming to an end, and the future of warfare belonged to gunpowder. A fleet that sailed overland. One of the most striking episodes of the entire siege was the maneuver Mehmed pulled off after his fleet failed to force its way into the Golden Horn, the narrow inlet protecting the city from the north, sealed off at its entrance by a massive chain the Byzantines had stretched across the water. Unable to break the chain by force, Mehmed ordered a wooden track built and greased with fat and oil, running overland around the Janos quarter of Pera, which was nominally neutral in the conflict, and in a single night, according to legend, in a matter of hours, had roughly 70 ships hauled across it entirely by land, on rollers and with the help of ox teams, then lowered into the water already inside the harbor, behind the defenders' backs. On the morning of April 22 ND, 1453, the defenders of Constantinople woke up to find the Ottoman fleet exactly where it physically shouldn't have been, inside a harbor supposedly protected and secure. The psychological effect of that sight, according to contemporary accounts, was arguably even more devastating than the actual military threat those ships posed. It became unmistakably clear, not only were the walls powerless against the besiegers, geography itself was powerless too. 50,000 against 100,000. The scale of the disproportion in forces is staggering even today. Under Constantine's command were, by various estimates, somewhere between 7 and 10,000 defenders, including roughly 2,000 foreign mercenaries and volunteers, chief among them a Genoese contingent led by the experienced condottiero Giovanni Giustiniani, who played one of the key roles in the city's defense. This tiny garrison had to defend a wall perimeter nearly 20 kilometers long. Mehmed's army, according to varying estimates from modern historians, numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 men, a figure that varies significantly depending on the source and counting method, but which in any case outnumbered the defenders by a ratio that couldn't be offset by valor or wall height alone. Nearly 2 months of siege turned into an exhausting, round-the-clock struggle over every breach, every tower, every meter of wall, which had to be patched night after night with makeshift materials, only to be knocked down again by Ottoman artillery the next day. The empire that begged for help no one sent before turning to the siege itself. It is worth understanding just how desperate Constantine's diplomatic position already was before the first Ottoman cannon ever appeared beneath the walls. The empire's final decades were marked by increasingly frantic, almost humiliating attempts by Byzantine emperors to beg military assistance from Catholic Europe, France, Venice, Genoa, and above all the Pope in Rome. The core problem was the schism that had divided the Christian world since the 11th century. Orthodox Byzantium and the Catholic West had been formally at odds over doctrine for centuries, and any Western military aid inevitably came bundled with the demand for church union, meaning the effective subordination of the Orthodox Church to papal authority. Just months before the siege, such a union was indeed formally proclaimed inside Hagia Sophia, a deal born of desperation, meant to buy Western troops and ships at any cost. But within Constantinople itself, the union sparked furious resistance from ordinary residents and clergy alike, many of whom openly declared they would rather see the Ottoman Sultan's turban in the city than the Pope's tiara. The union proved politically toxic at home while delivering almost no real military help from abroad. Most European powers, mired in their own internal wars and conflicts, limited themselves to sympathetic letters and tiny, symbolic detachments of volunteers, like Giustiniani's Genoese contingent. Venice and Genoa, the two largest maritime powers in the Mediterranean, formerly rivals competing for trade privileges in the region, were also in no hurry to send a full fleet, wary of jeopardizing their own highly profitable trade relationships with the rising Ottoman power. Some Venetian and Genoese merchants who happened to be in the city on business at the time ultimately stayed and volunteered to fight alongside the defenders, but that was a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of help that could theoretically have saved the city, had Europe treated the threat as urgent rather than as someone else's distant problem. Rumors, omens, and the last liturgy. As the siege drew toward its conclusion, the city was gripped by an atmosphere of near-mystical despair mixed with superstition. Among the defenders and residents circulated prophecies dating back centuries, according to which Constantinople, founded by an emperor named Constantine, would fall under an emperor bearing the same name. An ominous coincidence, given that the last Byzantine ruler was indeed also named Constantine, just like the city's founder more than 1100 years earlier. Shortly before the final assault, according to eyewitness accounts, a strange glow was reportedly observed over the dome of Hagia Sophia, which many defenders interpreted as a sign that divine grace was abandoning the city. Historians treat such accounts with understandable caution, reasonably regarding them more as a product of collective panic and the stress of a months-long siege than a literal description of a real phenomenon. But the very fact that such stories emerged and spread specifically in the last days before the city fell speaks volumes about the psychological state of the besieged population. On the night before the decisive assault, according to chroniclers, a final joint liturgy was held in Hagia Sophia, uniting the city as Orthodox and Catholic Christians despite years of religious schism. A tragic, almost theatrical moment of unity in the face of shared destruction, one that many historians consider among the most poignant episodes in the entire story of Constantinople's fall. The night everything was decided by late May, relentless bombardment and repeated assaults had worn the defenders down to the breaking point. On May 29, before dawn, Mehmed threw all his forces into the decisive assault at once, wave after wave. First the irregular troops, the least valuable to him, meant to exhaust the defense and expose its weak points, then the regular Anatolian forces, and finally the elite Janissary Corps, the empire's finest professional soldiers. The defense held out longer than might have been expected, right up until the moment Giustiniani, commanding the critical sector of the wall at its weakest point, was severely wounded during one of the assaults. His evacuation, though militarily necessary, triggered panic among the Janos troops in that sector, and the defense there began to collapse rapidly. At almost the same moment, the defenders had apparently, by accident, left unlocked a small side gate in the walls known as the Kirkaporta, used for sorties, and a small Ottoman detachment managed to slip through it, coming up behind the defenders' lines. The combination of these two disasters, occurring almost simultaneously, proved fatal. The defense at the critical sector collapsed within minutes, and Ottoman troops poured into the city. The emperor who tore off his insignia. What exactly happened to Constantine in the battle's final hours remains unknown with certainty. His body was never identified with full confidence among the thousands of dead. According to the most widely accepted account, based on contemporary testimony, once it became unmistakably clear the city would fall, the emperor tore off his purple imperial regalia and insignia, choosing to die not as a symbol whose death or capture could be exploited for propaganda, but as an ordinary soldier fighting shoulder to shoulder with the last defenders at the gates. Legend has it he threw himself into the thick of the fighting, declaring he would rather die than live to see the empire fall, and vanished into the chaos of battle. A body later identified as the last Roman emperor's remains was found among the piles of the dead only by the gilded eagles embroidered on his boots. A detail that has become one of the most haunting in the historical memory of the city's fall. A world that changed in a single day. The fall of Constantinople was more than just the military defeat of one state. For contemporaries, it was an almost metaphysical shock. A state that traced its lineage directly back to ancient Rome. A state that had been considered the bulwark of Christendom in the East for nearly 1,000 years, ceased to exist in the span of a single May morning. Mehmed, who would go down in history under the epithet the Conqueror, rode into the captured city on horseback and, according to legend, went directly to Hagia Sophia, the largest Christian church of its time, where he immediately ordered the first Muslim prayer to be performed, converting the cathedral into a mosque. Constantinople became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, and remains Turkey's largest city to this day, now under the name Istanbul. There is also a far more practical, less symbolic consequence of this event, one historians often cite as an indirect cause of the age of exploration. After the city's fall, the Ottomans established full control over the overland trade routes connecting Europe to India and East Asia, the very routes through which spices, silk, and other Eastern goods had flowed into Europe for centuries. European powers, now cut off from their familiar overland routes, were forced to search for alternative paths to Asia, by sea, around Africa, or, as it would later turn out, in the opposite direction, across the Atlantic. It was precisely this search for new maritime routes that, within just a few decades, would lead Columbus to the shores of America. One single May morning, one breached through a crumbling wall, one unlocked side gate. And a 1,000-year-old empire, one that still remembered Julius Caesar, vanished from the map of the world, closing, along with it, the entire era historians have agreed to call the Middle Ages.